Welcome to WW2 Heroic Tales, where true stories of courage, sacrifice, and extraordinary heroism come alive from the darkest days of World War II. Join us as we uncover the untold moments that shaped history. Winter 1944. The Allied invasion of Italy, intended to be a swift strike into the soft underbelly of Europe, had ground to a bloody halt. Before them lay the Gustav Line, a chain of German fortifications slicing across the Italian peninsula, anchored by a formidable natural fortress, Monte Cassino. This was not merely a mountain. It was a symbol of defiance, crowned by a 6th-century Benedictine monastery that stared down impassively upon the Liri Valley, the main route to Rome. Generalfield Marshal Albert Kesselring, a master of defensive warfare, had transformed this landscape into a death trap. His engineers had dammed rivers to flood the valleys, blasted bridges, and seeded every potential approach with mines. The German 1st Parachute Division, the elite Fallschirmjäger, were dug into the razor-sharp ridges and fortified cellars, their positions perfectly camouflaged and sited to create interlocking fields of fire. The weather itself was an enemy. Icy rain turned the ground to a slick, freezing mud, while snow blanketed the higher peaks. Allied soldiers from America, Britain, France, and New Zealand had already thrown themselves against this wall, only to be repulsed with horrific casualties. The first battle for Cassino in January had been a brutal failure. A maelstrom of artillery, machine gun fire, and desperate, futile advances. The mountains seemed to bleed soldiers, swallowing entire battalions without yielding a single yard. For the Allied command, Monte Cassino was more than a military objective. It was a psychological obsession, a key that had to be turned to unlock the path to Rome and prove the Italian campaign was not a catastrophic miscalculation. Something or someone new was needed to break the deadlock. A force accustomed to the world's most unforgiving terrain was about to enter the fray. Into this frozen hellscape marched the 4th Indian Infantry Division. Known as the Red Eagle Division, they were a hardened, professional force, part of the largest volunteer army in history. Their ranks were a mosaic of the Indian subcontinent, filled with soldiers from warrior traditions stretching back centuries. Among them were the men of the 4/6th Rajputana Rifles, heirs to the legacy of the Rajput warriors of northwestern India, and the legendary Gurkhas of the 1/2nd and 1/9th Gurkha Rifles, recruited from the mountain kingdoms of Nepal. For these men, the terrain of Monte Cassino was eerily familiar. The jagged peaks, the sheer rock faces, and the plunging ravines were a chilling echo of the Himalayas they called home. They were mountain fighters by birth and by training, uniquely suited for the task ahead. But this was Italy, thousands of miles from their homes, fighting a war for an empire that still ruled over their own land. Yet their professionalism and loyalty to their regiments were absolute. The 4th Indian Division had already earned a fearsome reputation in the deserts of North Africa, and now brought their expertise to the mountains of Italy. Nearly 50,000 Indian soldiers would serve in the Italian campaign, a fact often relegated to a footnote in Western histories. They were a vital component of the British Eighth Army, their turbans and Gurkha hats a common sight on the front lines. They arrived at Cassino with the grim understanding that they were being thrown into a battle that had already broken other elite divisions. Their commanders believed that their unique skills in mountain warfare could succeed where others had failed. The soldiers themselves, quiet and resolute, prepared for the ordeal, cleaning their Lee Enfield rifles and sharpening their kukri knives, knowing they were about to face a test unlike any other. The Allied plan for the Second Battle of Cassino was codenamed Operation Avenger. It was a two-pronged assault designed to finally shatter the Gustav Line's linchpin. The 2nd New Zealand Division would attack Cassino Town from the north, while the 4th Indian Division was given the truly formidable task, a direct assault on the mountain itself. Their objectives were two of the most treacherous features on the entire front. The first was Point 593, a barren, rocky knoll along a feature grimly named Snakeshead Ridge. This point was the key to the entire ridge system leading to the monastery. The second objective was the monastery itself. A deep controversy surrounded this ancient abbey. Allied intelligence suspected it was being used by the Germans as an artillery observation post, a belief that, while fiercely debated, ultimately sealed its fate. The plan called for the Indian troops to launch a silent night assault, using stealth and their mountain skills to close with the enemy before the Germans could bring their immense firepower to bear. The 4/6th Rajputana Rifles were assigned the daunting task of taking Point 593. Simultaneously, the 1/9th and 1/2nd Gurkha Rifles would move up a deep ravine and scale the slopes towards the monastery. It was a plan that relied on surprise, speed, and almost superhuman endurance. The soldiers would be climbing near vertical faces of rock and scree in total darkness, under the noses of elite German paratroopers who knew every inch of the ground. The slightest noise, a dislodged stone, a muffled cough, could bring down a hurricane of fire. Before the infantry could move, however, the Allied command made a fateful decision. They would unleash the full might of their air power to obliterate the monastery, believing it would crush German morale and eliminate their observation post. On the morning of February 15, 1944, the sky above Cassino roared to life. Wave after wave of American B-17 Flying Fortress and B-25 Mitchell bombers appeared, their bomb bays open. For hours, they circled the majestic monastery, a landmark that had stood for over 1,400 years, and unleashed a torrent of high explosives. Over 450 tons of bombs rained down upon the ancient walls. The structure, a symbol of peace and learning, was systematically pulverized. From the Allied lines below, soldiers watched in awe and horror as the abbey was wreathed in smoke and flame, its timeless silhouette crumbling into a chaotic pile of rubble. The bombing was a spectacular display of air power, but it was a catastrophic tactical blunder. While historical consensus now agrees the Germans were not occupying the monastery before the bombing, the destruction created the perfect fortress for them. The massive stone walls, some 10 feet thick, were shattered into a mountain of broken rock and debris. The deep, vaulted cellars and crypts, however, remained largely intact. This new landscape of ruins provided the German 1st Parachute Division with a virtually impregnable defensive position. They immediately moved into the rubble, creating a labyrinth of sniper nests, machine gun posts, and mortar pits that were impossible to target with artillery. The bombing had not eliminated the German position. It had handed them the strongest defensive terrain imaginable. For the soldiers of the 4th Indian Division, waiting to begin their assault, the sight was deeply unsettling. They were now tasked with attacking not a building, but a mountain of jagged stone, each piece of which could hide a German paratrooper with a machine gun. The path to their objective had just become infinitely more dangerous. The night of February 17th fell with a bitter, penetrating cold. A sliver of moon offered little light, shrouding the slopes of Monte Cassino in near-total darkness. This was the moment for which the 4th Indian Division had prepared. Cloaked in shadows, the Rajputanas and Gurkhas began their ascent. Every sound was magnified in the stillness. The crunch of boots on loose shale, the scrape of a rifle against rock, the strained breathing of men carrying heavy loads of ammunition and grenades. They were moving into a landscape of death. The slopes were not just steep. They were a treacherous maze of ravines and sheer rock faces, made slick by the freezing rain. The ground was sown with German S-mines, the infamous bouncing Betty, that would leap into the air before detonating, spraying lethal shrapnel at waist height. The soldiers moved with incredible discipline, relying on the skills honed in the mountains of their homeland. Hand signals replaced spoken words. They climbed hand over hand, their bodies pressed against the cold stone, feeling for each foothold. The objective for the 4/6th Rajputana Rifles, .593, was a gnarled fist of rock dominating Snakeshead Ridge. From its peak, German machine guns could command every approach. The Gurkhas moved up a separate, equally perilous route towards the monastery ruins. For hours they climbed, the tension mounting with every foot of elevation gained. They were ghosts in the night, inching ever closer to an unseen, waiting enemy. The German paratroopers were patient, disciplined, and masters of their craft. They listened, their ears tuned to the unnatural sounds of the mountain, their fingers resting on the triggers of their MG-42 machine guns, ready to tear the night apart. Suddenly, the night erupted. A single tripwire, a misplaced foot, and the darkness was banished by the blinding white light of a German flare. In an instant, the ghostly shapes of the Rajputana Rifles on Snakeshead Ridge were silhouetted against the rock. The night became a cacophony of violence. The distinctive, terrifying rip of German MG-42s, the Hitler's buzzsaw, tore through the thin mountain air. Mortar rounds began to walk across the slopes, their explosions echoing in the ravines and sending shards of rock and steel flying in every direction. The assault on .593 had become a desperate struggle for survival. The Rajputanas were caught in a perfectly prepared killing zone. S-mines, triggered by the advancing men, leaped from the ground, scything through their ranks. Despite the hellish fire, the soldiers charged. They rose from behind what little cover they could find and ran forward, firing their rifles and hurling grenades at the unseen enemy positions. Company after company was thrown into the meat grinder. They would gain a few yards, capture a machine gun nest, only to be cut down by another one positioned just beyond it. The fighting was intimate and brutal. Men fought and fell among the jagged rocks, their bravery almost beyond comprehension. They made repeated, suicidal charges into the teeth of the German defense, driven by a profound sense of duty and regimental honor. But courage alone could not overcome fortified positions and overwhelming firepower. The ranks of the 4/6 Rajputana Rifles were being systematically destroyed. The radio calls back to headquarters told a grim story of mounting casualties and an assault that was stalling just short of its objective. For the men on Snakeshead Ridge, the battle had become a nightmare from which there was no escape. While the Rajputanas were being bled white on Snakeshead Ridge, the Gurkhas were fighting their own desperate battle on the slopes below the monastery. The 1/9th and 1/2nd Gurkha Rifles had used their legendary stealth to get perilously close to the German positions in the ruins. Their assault was a whirlwind of sudden, shocking violence. Chilling shouts of "Io Gurkhali," "The Gurkhas are coming," cut through the din of battle as they surged from the darkness. This was warfare at its most primeval. The Gurkhas, masters of close-quarters combat, brought their kukris into play. This heavy, curved knife was not just a weapon, but a symbol of their warrior spirit. In the confusing labyrinth of rubble, they closed with the German paratroopers. The fighting devolved into a series of frantic, isolated skirmishes in the dark. A grenade tossed into a cellar, a bayonet thrust, the swift, deadly arc of a kukri. The Gurkhas fought with a ferocity that stunned even the battle-hardened Fallskirmjäger. They scaled shattered walls and leaped into German positions, their small stature belying their immense strength and courage. They managed to gain a foothold in the outer edges of the ruined monastery, a remarkable feat of arms. But like the Rajputanas, they were taking terrible losses. The Germans had turned the ruins into a fortress of interlocking fire. Every pile of rubble seemed to spit machine gun fire. Mortars rained down with pinpoint accuracy. The Gurkhas were isolated, their communication lines shredded, and their ammunition running low. They held their small gains with grim determination, knowing that without reinforcements and with dawn approaching, their position would become a death trap. The battle cry that had struck fear into their enemies now mingled with the cries of their own wounded, scattered across the unforgiving slopes. For a few desperate hours in the darkness, it seemed as if the impossible might be achieved. The Rajputanas, despite their horrific losses, had managed to secure a small lodgment on the slopes of Point 593. The Gurkhas clung precariously to the western edge of the monastery ruins. These were fleeting gains, purchased with a river of blood. The men were exhausted, freezing, and running out of ammunition. They had been fighting for hours in some of the most difficult terrain imaginable, against an elite, implacable foe. As the first hints of gray began to lighten the eastern sky, the tactical situation became brutally clear. Dawn would expose their positions to the full fury of the German defenders. Without control of the commanding heights, they would be systematically annihilated by artillery, mortar, and machine gun fire. The German paratroopers, sensing the Allied assault was losing momentum, began to launch vicious counterattacks. They moved with expertise through the terrain they knew so well, using grenades and automatic weapons to dislodge the exhausted Indian soldiers from their hard-won footholds. The battle reached a bitter climax as the sun began to rise. The commanders, faced with the prospect of their battalions being wiped out entirely, made the heartbreaking decision to withdraw. The order was passed down the line: fall back. This was perhaps the most dangerous phase of the operation. The soldiers had to disengage from a close and determined enemy and retreat back down the same treacherous slopes, now under the clear observation of German gunners. They carried as many of their wounded as they could, a slow, agonizing procession under constant fire. The daring night assault, launched with such high hopes, had ended in a bloody repulse. The Indian Division had thrown itself against the mountain, and the mountain had broken them. As the survivors of the 4th Indian Division stumbled back to their lines, the full cost of the night's battle became horrifyingly apparent. The assault had been a catastrophic failure in terms of objectives gained, but the price paid in human lives was staggering. The butcher's bill was a testament to the ferocity of the fighting and the incredible bravery of the men involved. The 4/6 Rajputana Rifles, who had borne the brunt of the assault on Point 593, had been decimated. Out of the battalion that went up the mountain, 196 men were killed, wounded, or missing. The 1/9th Gurkha Rifles had suffered 149 casualties. The 1/2nd Gurkha Rifles lost 96. In total, the 4th Indian Division sustained over 590 casualties in this single phase of the battle alone. These were not just numbers. They were friends, brothers and sons who had fallen on a desolate mountain far from home. The medical aid posts were overwhelmed with wounded, a scene of quiet suffering and heroic efforts by doctors and orderlies. The spirit of the division, while not broken, was deeply wounded. They had given everything they had, displaying a level of courage that drew admiration even from their German opponents. Medals for valor would later be awarded, but they were little consolation for the loss of so many fine soldiers. The failure was not one of courage, but of a plan that asked too much of any soldier. It was a brutal lesson in the realities of the Gustav Line. Monte Cassino could not be taken by valor alone. It was a fortress that demanded overwhelming, coordinated power, something the Allies had yet to bring to bear. For the survivors, the memory of that night on the mountain, the flares, the machine guns, the cries of the wounded, would be forever seared into their minds. In the cold calculus of war, the Indian Army's assault on Monte Cassino in February 1944 was a tactical defeat. No ground of strategic value was held. Yet its true significance lies beyond the immediate outcome. The sacrifice of the Rajputanas and Gurkhas was a crucial, if costly, contribution to the wider Allied campaign. Their ferocious assault, though repulsed, inflicted significant casualties on the elite German paratroopers and forced Kesselring to keep his best troops fixed on the Cassino sector. They had proven that the mountain's defenses could be breached, even if they couldn't be held, planting a seed of doubt in the German command. The battle for Monte Cassino would rage for 3 more months. It would take 2 more massive Allied offensives before the Gustav Line was finally broken in May 1944, not by a direct assault on the monastery, but by a coordinated attack across the entire front, with Polish troops ultimately raising their flag over the ruins. The contribution of the Indian Army in this and other battles across Italy is one of the most overlooked chapters of the Second World War. Of the nearly 50,000 Indian soldiers who served in the Italian campaign, 57 made the ultimate sacrifice and are buried in cemeteries across the country. Their heroism on the slopes of Monte Cassino, in terrain as tough as the Himalayas, is a story that has been too often forgotten in Western narratives of the war. They were soldiers of an empire, fighting for a cause of global freedom while their own nation was still seeking its own. Their legacy is one of extraordinary bravery in the face of impossible odds, a testament to the enduring spirit of the Indian soldier. Thank you for joining WW2 Heroic Tales. Through the stories of brave souls from World War II, we honor their memory and keep their legacy alive for history and generations to come.